Welcome to the loft, Ayers' house. Cosy, isn't it? I trust you're relaxed and comfortable. It's 1858. We're going on a journey to the Erremonga Basin with John McDouall Stuart. Not one of those they made me drink curdled milk at primary school and I took up heroin to get the taste out of my mouth and spent half my life in jail and rehab till I discovered the power of mathematic yoga, regression theory, poetry therapy type of journeys. No, not one of those. Not one of those let's drill down into it and unpack it, whatever that means, type of journeys. No, this is a real journey, a survey and mapping journey. 3 blokes, 6 horses and a meagre supply of flour and beef jerky. We're going to the inland sea, the Dead Heart.
Friday, 11th of June, West Plain. The plains are fearfully dry. They have the appearance as if no rain had fallen here for a long time, and I'm very much afraid there will be no water at Bida. If such should be the case, the horses will suffer too much in the beginning of their journey to be without a drink tonight. I think it will be best to return to Mudliapa. Leave our saddles, rations, etc. there and drive the horses back to water. Bearings, Mount Arden, 154 degrees 30 minutes. Mount Ayr, 77 degrees 30 minutes. Bida Hill, 272 degrees. Sunday, 13th of June, Mudliapa. Started for Bida. Some of the horses wouldn't drink the water, and others drank very little. They will be glad to drink far worse than this before they come back, or I am much mistaken. Arrived at Bida at sundown. No fresh water to be found, nothing but salt, saltier than the sea. I was unable to fix Bida Hill, all my time being taken up in looking for the water, but I hope to get its position at Panatta. The country was very heavy, sandhill.
Sorry, before we go on, I have to read this. A formal notice pursuant to the War on Terror Freedom of Speech Enhancement Regulations 2014. An artistic licence has been issued for this performance. Pursuant to Regulation 14B, statements, true or not, overt or implied, that may give comfort to a vague and ill-defined enemy will breach the artistic licence and render the performer liable to punishment. Laughter, at or with such statements, may constitute conspiracy. Signed by the Attorney-General, for and on behalf of Team Australia. We're in an age of terror. We live in dangerous times. The 1850s were dangerous times in Australia. They had been for the past 70 years. The country had been swamped with boat people. The boat people had brought terrible diseases that wiped out whole families and weakened clans and tribes. Men came on horses with guns. Disease, slaughter, murder and death on an unimaginable scale. Terror ruled the land. Poor fellow, my country. In 1858, the newly empowered South Australian colonial government was preoccupied with selling stolen land, maintaining its monopoly on colonial communication, growing wheat, grazing sheep, selling drugs, swindling shareholders, mining copper, insider trading, and civilising themselves and their city-state. They'd sent William Herschel Babbage, a scientist of independent means, to explore northwest of Port Augusta. His was a scientific survey expedition, searching for minerals, mapping land, collecting soil and botanical samples. He had carts, sheep, drilling and desalination equipment, equipped for a long journey at a cost of £6,000. His progress was thorough but slow. Members of Parliament were eager for quick finds of new pastoral land and water. John McDouall Stuart was a privateer. He was backed by the less than scrupulous pastoralist miner and general swindler William Fink and the rascally Chambers brothers John and James, particularly James. Stuart had been employed by them for nearly a decade as a pastoral and mineral lease surveyor. They profited from his finds. Stuart and Babbage's separate parties meet at Panatta. Stuart knows he's undertaking a dangerous journey. He'd learned from his expedition with Captain Sturt that water and the daily search for it is the key to their survival. He learned to travel light, keep moving.
Tuesday, 15th of June, Sandhills. Started at break of day for Panatta. About 10 a.m. met Mr. Babbage's two men. I intended to keep on the track, but our black insisted that Panatta lay through a gap and not round the bluff. I allowed him to have his own way. Our route was through a very stony saddle. When there we saw a gum creek and made for it. When we arrived at the creek, he told us that was Panatta. We looked for water and found a little hole, which to our great disappointment contained salt water. Could see nothing of Mr. Babbage's camp. I then asked our black where there was another water, and he said down the creek, which we followed. He took us for 5 or 6 waterholes with native names, every one dry. The last one he called Uluru. It being now within an hour of sundown, I would follow him no longer, but unsaddled, and told Mr. Foster to take the black and the horses and to steer for the bluff. Wednesday, 16th of June, Uluru. I was wrong in blaming the black fellow. He took us to the right Panetta. It's another water that Mr. Babbage is encamped at. Mr. Babbage found the remains of poor Coulthard yesterday. He has sent for me to come and assist at the burial. It being so late in the day, 12 o'clock, and the horses requiring more water, and he having 4 men besides himself, I do not see that I can be of any use, and it might cause me to lose another day, and the horses to be another night without water, which would be an injury to them, they not having had sufficient this morning. Distance today, 17 miles.
The 1850s were dangerous times in Europe and Asia. In Europe, the Russians were meddling in the Crimea and Ukraine. A coalition of the willing, the British, French, Poles and Ottomans, gave the Russians a good shirt fronting at the River Alma, and later at Inkerman and Balaclava. These places are still remembered on the northern Adelaide plains as hamlets, and Alma out in the Mallee. By 1914, the Ottomans had become Johnny Turk, who, because a Serb had shot an Archduke, needed to be pushed from the Gallipoli Peninsula so that a fleet could sail into the Bosphorus and avenge poor little Belgium or something. In this centenary year, how many kiddies are going to make paper mache models of Simpson and his donkey and learn that this is what defines us as Australians? In 1858, the French invaded Aleppo in Syria, a humanitarian mission saving Christians from Muslims. Further west, the British, playing a great game with Russia, were pushing the Persians, now the Iranians, out of Herat in Afghanistan. They'd already had a go at it in 1838. Further east in Siam, now Vietnam, the French were invading Da Nang, presumably to keep it safe from the communists, or the British, or both. In China, the British were running a war on drugs, the Opium War. Well, they weren't actually fighting the drugs so much as using the proceeds from the sale of the drugs to finance an empire. The British really wanted a free trade agreement with China. In 1858, Adelaide was a mere 20-year-old. Churches, Institute of Learnings and libraries shared the square mile with the opium dens, pubs and clubs. The Adelaide Choral Society was formed in 1858, and in September 1858 a Friends of the Aborigines Association was granted £500 by Parliament. This house was built about 1847. Its original owner was William Paxton, an early settler in the colony who started out as a Hindley Street drug dealer. He was a person of interest in Dr. Wright's murder trial, an overdose of morphine given to a lunatic by the alcoholic Dr. Wright, and later Paxton had a barrel of drugs seized by the council for non-payment of rates. Paxton laundered his drug dealing profits into property and took up shares in the Borough Mining Company. In 1856, having made a fortune, he packed up and went home to the UK and sold this house, then known as Austral House, to his mate, the lawyer Henry Ayers. In July 1858, Henry Ayers had just moved in, and the mansion had not yet been completed. Picture Sir Henry up here unpacking his tea chests. It was a busy year for Henry, as well as running the Borough Mining Company. He'd just been elected to the newly established Independent Legislative Council. He was already a man of influence and was to go on and be Premier of the colony on 7 occasions over the next 4 decades, picking up a knighthood along the way and becoming the eponym for a monolith he never visited. Ayers Rock. It's not a rock. Too much sand. It's an Inselberg, a prominent isolated residual hill that arises abruptly from and is surrounded by extensive and relatively flat erosional lowlands. Ayers Inselberg. Just doesn't sound right, does it? Much of the interior of Australia is made up of ancient seabeds, ancient as in 500 million years ago. Gradually the sandstone erodes. Where the sandstone is strengthened by feldspar, the sandstone hardens and erodes at a much slower rate. This is called differential erosion. The resulting hills and ranges, often flat at the top, are called tent hills, or tabletop hills. Stuart doesn't see Ayers Inselberg, but opened up the way for Goss to do so in 1873. Stuart crosses the ancient seabeds, methodically mapping the erosional tabletops and tent hills, each vista as bleak as the last.
Friday the 18th of June, the Elizabeth. I am quite disappointed with this creek and the surrounding country. The hills are very stony with a little salt bush and destitute of timber, except a few gum trees in the creek and the mulga bushes in the sandhills. Distance today 25 miles over very bad country, with large fragments of hard flinty stone covering the surface. Salt bush with small sandhills, no water. Started at 9 a.m. on a course of 25 degrees for 16 miles. Our course today has been across stony plains, covered on the surface with fragments resembling hard white quartz, with sandhills about 2 miles broad dividing them. At a mile past a small table-topped hill to the west of our line. At 4 miles past another table-topped hill connected with a low range to the east, and past the first Ironstone Hill. The low range to the east of our course and running nearly parallel to it is composed of conglomerate quartz and a little ironstone. Tuesday the 22nd, Andamuka. At 7 miles and a half, crossed a low stony range running east-northeast and west-southwest, which turned out to be tableland, with sandhills crossing our line. The last 4 miles of today's journey have been over very stony rises, with salt bush and a little grass.
The early Australian colonial cartographers believed that the rivers that run west from the Great Coastal Range should feed an inland sea. They did millions of years ago. Now the rivers run dry and evaporate in the desiccating heat and spill spasmodically into enormous salt lakes. In 1844, Stuart had accompanied Captain Charles Sturt up the Darling, beyond Burke and Birdsville, in search of the inland sea. Reports had come from the northern frontier, then just north of Port Augusta, that the Aborigines talked of running water, rivers and streams to the north. It was called Wingalpin.
Thursday, 24th of June, Sandhills. At 12 miles, changed our course to 79 degrees to examine a gum creek, Yerrout, which we ran down for water, but did not obtain it before 4 miles, when we found a small hole of rainwater. This creek seems to be a hunting ground of the natives, as we saw a great many summer woolies on its banks. They had evidently been here today, for a little above where we first struck the creek, we saw smoke, but on the following it up, we found they had gone. Most likely they had seen us and run away. The latter part of our journey today was over stony plain, bounded on the west by stony tableland with the sandhills on the top. All this country seems to have been under water, and it is most likely the bed of Lake Torrens, or Captain Sturt's inland sea. In travelling over the plains, one is reminded of going over a rough, gravelly beach. The stones are all rounded and smooth. Distance today, 30 miles.
The great south land which Stuart is attempting to cross was called Terra Australis by the ancient Greeks. They reasoned that as the northern hemisphere had so much land, there should be some in the south to balance things out. They were right, as it turns out. Some early cartographers called it beach, which in all the circumstances was probably more accurate. Most maps, however, stuck with Terra Incognita Australis and simply dropped the incognita when all the beaches had been mapped. The Aborigines who'd been here from time immemorial called Australia home. They too were right, but those rights were not recognised until 200 years later. Too little, too late. The Native Title Act 1993, an act of prescription giving Commonwealth recognition to every act of the colonial crown's last near the land. The Native Title Act granted a bundle of ill-defined rights, but not ownership in the remnant fringes of the Crown land. Poor fellow, my country.
Thursday the 17th of June, Bottle Hill. Got on the top of Bottle Hill to take bearings, but was disappointed. Could see no hill except one, which was either Mount Deception or Mount Northwest. The bearing was 55 degrees 50 minutes. The country from the hill here is of the worst description. Nothing but sand and salt bush.
Ah, nothing but sand and salt bush. Nothing but bush. Hearing Stuart say nothing but salt bush sent me in search of Ayers' description of the Nullarbor, Sturt's description of the land north of the Murray. It niggled. Then it hit me like a right jab from a pugilist. I'd heard it recently.
As we look around this glorious city, as we see the extraordinary development, it's hard to think that back in 1788 it was nothing but bush.
Oh well, there goes 40,000 plus years of Australian history, hunting, gathering, gardening, to say nothing of the oldest extant culture in the world. A strict orthodox and complex law interwoven with rich and colourful lore, language, dance and song. A complex creation narrative that is set in the past, present and future, and starts at the centre of the earth and extends beyond the stars above. Nothing but bush, really. In 1788, the British established a penal settlement at Sydney.
Because the arrival of the First Fleet was the defining moment in the history of this continent.
Piss off, Tony. We're doing real history here. In 1788, the British took possession of the eastern half of the continent, then known as New Holland. The so-called defining moment proclamation only extended from the eastern coast to the Western Australian border. By 1627, the Dutch had systematically mapped much of the Western Australian coastline along the Great Australian Bight to St Peter's Island, just off the coast from Ceduna. They called it Neutsland, but despite urging from Batavia's Colonel Purry in 1717, Amsterdam remained more interested in condiments than continents. The first British governor, Arthur Phillip, tried to conciliate the affections of the Aborigines, but following a fatal dispute between his gardener and one of the local tribes, he instructed a couple of marine officers to lead a punitive raid to Botany Bay and behead 10 Aboriginal men to strike terror into the tribes. Watkins Tench, one of the marine officers, convinced the governor that it would be better to arrest 6. The governor agreed, but said that he'd hang 2 and under an 18th century version of special rendition send the other 4 to Norfolk Island. The operation was bungled as redcoats floundered in the swamps. The officially issued knives and bags for the heads were returned unused to the government stores. In 1816, the otherwise enlightened despot, Emancipist Governor Lachlan Macquarie, ordered the hanging of Aborigines in the Hawkesbury-Nepean region to strike terror into so-called rebellious tribes. Their bodies were left hanging on public display. The punitive raid and unofficially sanctioned massacres remained as established policy and practice until the first 2 decades of the last century. The last officially sanctioned raid being at Coniston in the Northern Territory in 1928, led by the Gallipoli veteran Constable William Murray. The proposed Arnhem Land Northern Territory Police punitive raid of 1932 was stopped by domestic and international public opinion and reluctant direction from Canberra. The conflict at the frontier rarely started with the explorers. The initial reaction of the Aborigines was bewilderment and fear. It was the competition for water and land by the pastoralists that led to the frontier wars. The explorers tread warily into the unknown and are reluctant to provoke confrontation. Stuart asks for directions to Wingpellin and meets a lone hunter. The startled man thinks Stuart and his party are centaurs.
Friday the 25th of June, Yarrow Gum Creek, bearing 292 degrees for 5 miles, sandhills, thence 327 degrees to a table hill 9 miles, camped without water. Our route today has been through sandhills with a few miles of stones and dry reedy swamp, all well grassed but no water. We came across some natives who kept a long distance off. I sent our black up to them to ask in which direction Winglepin lay. They pointed to the course I was then steering and said, 5 sleeps. They wouldn't come near us. About 3/4 of an hour afterwards, I came suddenly upon another native who was hunting in the sandhills. My attention being engaged in keeping the bearing, I did not observe him until he moved, but I pulled up at once lest he should run away and called to him. What he imagined I was, I do not know, but when he turned round and saw me, I never beheld a finer picture of astonishment and fear. He was a fine muscular fellow, about 6 foot in height, and stood as if riveted to the spot, with his mouth wide open and his eyes staring. I sent our black forward to speak with him, but omitted to tell him to dismount. The terrified native remained motionless, allowing our black to ride within a few yards of him, when in an instant he threw down his waddies and jumped up into a mulga bush as high as he could, 1 foot being about 3 foot above the ground and the other about 2 foot higher, and kept waving us off with his hand as we advanced. I expected every moment to see the bush break with his weight. I told our black to inquire if he were a Winglepin native. He was so frightened he couldn't utter a word, and trembled from head to foot. We then asked him where Winglepin was. He mustered courage to let go one hand, and emphatically snapping his fingers in a northwest direction, waved us off. About an hour before sunset, we came in full sight of a number of tent and table-topped hills to the northwest, the stony tableland being to the south of us, and the dip of the country still towards Lake Torrens. The horses' shoes have been torn quite thin by the stones, and will not last above a day or two. Nay, some of the poor animals are already shoeless. It is most unfortunate that we did not bring another set with us. Distance today 24 miles.
In 1830, Captain Charles Stuart had rowed, well his men did, down the River Murray, and remarkably and surely harder back up. Stuart's description of the coastal plains of South Australia led the imprisoned debtor, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, who'd never been there, to write a letter from Sydney, the business case for the establishment of the South Australian Company. If in 1717 the directors of the Dutch East India Company had listened to Colonel Purry, South Australia, or Neutsland as they called it, would have been settled by the Dutch. The swamps of the Padawalunga and Karawira would have been drained. Semaphore would be full of dykes. I have to apologise for that. It's homophobic, sexist, possibly racist, and even worse, not my own word. I'm sorry I can't remember where I heard it. In 1829, with the Dutch out of the way and the French as ever a threat, the British proceeded to seize the western half of the island continent. The continent was now known as Australia, following publication of Flinders' remarkably accurate map of his circumnavigation. In the 1830s, there were only 3 colonies: New South Wales and Swan River, now Western Australia, Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania. Sydney was the capital. Melbourne, settled in 1835, remained subordinate to Sydney until 1851 and is still getting over it. Just as Terra Australis had been a continent waiting to be located, Adelaide was a city waiting to be located somewhere in the new colony. A motley collection of fast money men from the City of London saw profit in Wakefield's plan. They were joined by idealists, dreamers, nonconformists, many from Germany fleeing religious persecution, adventurers and others just seeking a better life. They obtained a royal charter, their own Act of the Imperial Parliament, South Australian Foundation Act of 15th of August 1834, and letters patent. A new colony was carved out of New South Wales. They set out from London in 1836 and joined a band of marauders on Kangaroo Island, bickering amongst themselves whether Adelaide should be on the banks of the Kirawira or Port Lincoln. The new colony of South Australia was to be free enterprise at its best. No convicts, a simple but amoral business plan. Ignore the letters patent, steal the land from the Aborigines, declare it waste and unsettled, vested in the Crown, legitimising the larceny. Land is not capable of being larceny, and larceny is a noun that should not be verbified, but it alliterates well. Call it what you will. Seize, steal, alienate, dispossess, steal. They stole it. Having vested the land in the Crown, they then felt free to sell the land to each other and investors and settlers in an early model Ponzi scheme. We thought native title was hard and divisive. Wait until we confront the real issue: sovereignty. John McDouall Stuart was one of the early settlers. His father had been an army officer and Stuart trained as an army engineer. In 1840, at the age of 23, he sailed on the Indus to the new colony, where he found work as a surveyor on the edges of the settled land.
Saturday the 26th of June, edge of plain. After 10 miles the sandhills ceased, and at 13 miles we reached the point of the stony tableland. The first of the 7 or 8 tent-like hills that were to the east of our route today presents a somewhat remarkable appearance. Of a conical form, it comes to a point like a Chinaman's hat, and is encircled near the top by a black ring, while some rocks resembling a white tower crown the summit. There are flat-top ranges running northeast. Further to the south, at a distance of about 10 miles, is still a stony tableland with the sandhills. The country is fearfully stony.
Stuart learned bushcraft and had an uncanny skill at reading country and finding water. In the town and city he fell into darkness and the demon drink. Glenelg, the site of the colony's proclamation, was one of the first land sales of the new colony. The land ballot was corrupted by fraud and insider trading. This was led by Mr. William Fink and other government and company officials. The stench of corruption overpowered the rotting seaweed and stinking algae slime of the Padawalunga. There were too many insiders, like Morfitt and Gillies, and Mr. Fink was a gentleman, now a very rich gentleman. God bless their little English hearts. They'd even called the Padawalunga the Thames on early maps. Stuart met William Fink in the late 1840s, and together they travelled through the bush and mallee country west of Port Augusta and on Ayr Peninsula. Stuart mapped pastoral leases for William Fink. It was Fink who engaged Stuart at £20 a week to undertake his first journey north. In 1844, Stuart had been taken on by Captain Charles Sturt as a draftsman on Sturt's attempt to find a Gestadt inland sea or the centre of the continent. Sturt adopted the expedition approach. Sturt had carts, flocks of sheep, even a boat and sailors. He was totally dependent on finding permanent water and establishing depots. From those depots, smaller journeys, often led by Stuart, were undertaken. They travelled up the River Darling and became stranded at the diminishing and by then aptly named Preservation Creek for 6 months over summer. They found nothing but impenetrable salt lakes and desert, the stony Strzelecki and Simpson amongst others. At one stage, Stuart had been deceived by a mirage, so strong and clear he believed he was looking at a vast lake. Stuart made 6 major journeys, on his first solo journey as they inched towards what we now know as Coober Pedy.
Monday the 28th of June, Gum Creek. Changed our bearing again to 281 degrees for 22 miles to a tent hill. This part of the country is very stony and bad, with salt bush and very little grass. It has evidently been the course of a large water at some time, and reminded me of the stony desert of Captain Sturt. Bleak, barren and desolate, it grows no timber, so that we scarcely can find sufficient wood to boil our quart pot. Our travelling today has been still very stony, over stony rises, stony tableland that has been all along on our left is now trending more to the southwest. The country is more open. In looking at it from one of the rises, it has the appearance of an immense plain studded with isolated flat-topped hills. At 12 miles ascended a high flat-topped hill commanding a view of an immense stony plain, but it is so hazy that we can see nothing beyond 10 miles.
What makes Stuart stand out is that he doesn't die out there. None of his companions do. Stuart doesn't disappear like Leichhardt, perish of hunger and thirst like Coulthard or Gibson and countless others, die from arrogant stupidity and misadventure like Burke and Wills, or get shot by a camel like Horrocks. Stuart returns from each journey with all his companions, detailed maps and plans in his prosaic journal. The maps are later used to establish tracks and roads and depots across the continent, enabling Todd to complete the telegraph line and link Australia to the world. The colony built a train line to Kapunda to service the mines. Stuart used to catch the train to Kapunda and then head off into the unknown. How can a country be so settled and yet so unmapped at the same time?
Thursday, 1st of July, Gum Creek. About half a mile below us, there's a large waterhole, a quarter of a mile long, with a number of black ducks upon it. They're very shy. It rained very heavily and without intermission all last night and today. This creek is visited by a great many natives. We saw them making way as we approached. A plain thinly covered with gravelly stones consisting of quartz, ironstone and a dark reddish-brown stone with a good deal of gypsum cropping out. The soil is of a light brown colour with plenty of dry grass upon it and very little saltbush. This was a beautiful day, not a cloud to be seen. There are a great many native tracks in these sandhills and plenty of grass. Thursday the 8th of July, Sandhills. At 12 miles the sandhills ceased and we came upon an elevated plain of a light brown soil with fragments of stone on the surface. At 25 miles in the middle of this plain we camped without wood and in sight of a large range in the far distance to the west.
By 1858, Port Misery had been renamed Port Adelaide. They thought about calling it Port Power, but rejected it because abstract nouns sound stupid out of context. The Karrawirra River was renamed the Torrens and turned into an open sewer. The Adelaide Plains overstocked and overgrazed. The Ghana people had been reduced to mendacity in their own land. Wine grapes, not tulips, were planted in the hills. Around the city, park lands were set aside to be used as cow paddocks and rubbish dumps. The train line from Kapunda brought copper down from Burra, and a telegraph line connected the port to the city. 5-month-old news and mail from London was expressed from Perth in specially chartered clippers. Adelaide was the communication hub for the eastern colonies. The telegraph line along Stuart's track would maintain that superiority for several decades. The brilliant young Charles Todd, astronomer, meteorologist and electrical engineer, had arrived in Adelaide in 1855. He'd been selected by the Royal Astronomer for appointment as astronomer and supervisor of telegraph. By July 1858, he'd linked Adelaide and Melbourne by telegraph. The telegraph let people send short messages over very long distances very quickly. A new language was developed to stop wear and tear on the operators' thumbs and reduce costs and time. COB, close of business, ETA, estimated time of arrival, and the like. LOL, leaving old London. Todd and his Victorian counterpart, Samuel McGowan, became friends, not rivals. They agreed on uniform systems and shared the vision of the colonies being linked with each other and ultimately the world. At a political level, the two colonies were engaged in a race to Darwin. The prize would be the Northern Territory and overland telegraph line. Stuart came to believe he would find the track to Darwin.
Sunday the 11th of July, same place. This morning the sun rose at 62 degrees. The view to the northeast is over an immense stony plain with broken hills in the distance. To the north is also the plain with table hills in the far distance. To the northwest is the termination of a range running northeast and southwest, distant about 10 miles. About halfway between is a Gum Creek running to the northeast. To the west is the same range and a number of conical hills between. This range is very stony, composed of hard, milky white flint stone and the white and yellow chalky substance. I think we have now made the dip of the country to the south, but the mirage is so powerful that little bushes appear like great gum trees, which makes it very difficult to judge what is before us. It is almost as bad as travelling in the dark. I never saw it so bright, nor so continuous as it is now. One would think that the whole country was under water. We camped without water.
The clue is in the A. Stuart, Sturt. Sunny, Shear. Air, Ayers. For prophets, 40 days in the desert seems to be the mandated period. Moses on Mount Sinai, Jesus in the wilderness, Noah on the ark. Well, the flood wasn't really a desert. The ascension of Christ, Lent, Muhammad at Hira. If Stuart had wanted to spend 40 days in the desert, he would have packed up by now and headed back to Port Augusta. He only had a month's supply of flour and beef jerky. The Shia, with an A, recognise Ali as the prophet's successor and believe the Mahdi, the Redeemer, like a reserve in cricket, is the 12th Imam, lives amongst us and will return with Christ to fill the world with justice on the Day of Judgment. The Sunni believe the Mahdi is not yet born, but will also appear with Christ on the Day of Judgment. The Jews celebrate Ashura as a day of atonement. The Shia celebrate Ashura as a day of mourning for the death of Ali's son Hussein at the Battle of Karbala, and 40 days later the pilgrimage of Abbott to Karbala in Iraq. The Shia, Ali, Ashura, Abbott. The rest falls into place like angels dancing on pins. The struggle for temporal power, misinterpreting tribal custom as Sharia, empires and nations, colonialism, languages, geography, history, oil and Kalashnikovs are a potent mix. The ignorant conflate jihad, the inner struggle against sin, with the outer struggle, what Christians called holy war. Stuart and Sturt face north down King William Street in Victoria Square. Sturt with an A, is our man in marble, think alabaster. Stuart without an A, his mentor, is in bronze and did boats. Sturt was so respected they named a football team after him. Stuart eventually got the highway to Darwin. Ayers with an E is the bloke who walked across the Nullarbor and later on the River Murray as protector of Aborigines, arguably prevented the wholesale slaughter of the Murray tribes, as lawless squatters flocked or overland to the new colony. Ayers, with an A, owned this house. He got the rock and a knighthood. It's not Ayers' rock. But if it was, where would the apostrophe go? Strictly speaking, and grammar police only ever speak thus, at the end, of course, with the possessive S, and as Ayers' sounds wrong, we follow the rule of what sounds right, and drop the apostrophe and possessive S, and are back where we started. Pesky thing, the English language.
Monday the 12th of July, large salt bush and grass plain. There was a very heavy white frost during the night. It was bitterly cold. Not a hill to be seen either to the southwest or west. Nothing but plain. The stony plain seems to continue a long way to the southwest, but the country being undulating and the mirage so strong, I cannot say precisely. I intend to see where this creek will lead me, for I cannot face the stones again. Went to the highest point on the stony range east of us, but could only see a very short distance. There are a number of creeks on the eastern side, running into this one. The range is low and very stony, composed of flints and pebbles of all colours.
It's not Ayers Rock, it's Uluru. Always has been, always will be. Just to the west of Uluru are a group of domed rocks. In 1872, Giles called them the Olgas after Queen Olga of Württemberg in Germany. Queen Olga's husband, King Charles, had an American lover, Charles Woodcock. Later, for a short time, Baron Savage. Olga did not appear to have a secret lover and was much admired. She never visited her rocks. They are Carta Jutta. Always have been, always will be. A Passion Sons, silversmiths of Mayfair, have a fine silver table garniture for sale for £1.9 million. The mirror plateau and candelabra were a gift in 1839 from Queen Adelaide to her then Lord Chamberlain, Earl Howe. They come in oak and iron-bound cases engraved. for Queen Adelaide and Lord Howe. Lord Howe added the 10-light candelabra after her death. He remained a close member of her household, despite being sacked by the Prime Minister in 1834. Adelaide's marriage to William, 27 years her senior, was arranged to produce a legitimate heir. They met a week before the wedding. She accepted his 10 illegitimate children into her household with good grace. Despite bearing 3 children, none lived to take the throne, which passed to Victoria. Queen Adelaide was an unreconstructed Tory, opposed to the reform bills of 1821. She was accused by the Times newspaper of being the prime mover in the dismissal of Lord Melbourne's government. The official line is that any suggestion of intimacy between Her Majesty Queen Adelaide, and her Lord Chamberlain was just a malicious rumour spread by her political opponents. I'd have written to Buckingham Palace for more information. They seem to be busy, denying Andrew's involvement with underage girls, rumours about Harry's paternity, and plotting to kill Charles so that William can slip into the job.
Wednesday the 14th of July, same place. I shall follow down the creek and see what it leads to. It has been excessively cold today, wind from the west. Friday, 16th of July, large plain, Mulga and Gum Creek. Left the camp at 9 a.m. on a bearing of 270 degrees for 9 miles. To the northwest we could see the range that we crossed on the 11th instant, trending away to the northwest as far as the eye could reach. Apparently a sandy and scrubby country with small patches of open ground intervening. Camped tonight without water. We saw some native woolies and the track of a number of natives having passed this place a day or 2 ago, going to the southwest. Foster caught an opossum, the first that we'd seen. We intend making a dinner from him today. This is our first game, and we have been able to secure, except 2 small ducks we had at the beginning of our journey. We have found water a little way down the valley. I think I can see a gum creek to the east of us, but the mirage is so powerful that I'm not quite certain. Finding that we have sandhills to cross, and being anxious to meet with the gum creek that the blacks have talked about. The wood is very tough and heavy, and burns a long time, giving out a glowing heat. The leaves resemble the mulga, but are of a darker colour and smaller size. The native name is Marachi. Shot a wallaby and had him for dinner. They are very wild, no getting within shot of them, which is unfortunate as our provisions are getting rather short. From the number of native tracks about, this would seem to be their season for hunting in the sandhills, which accounts for everything being so wild. I shall go no further to the east on this course, for I can see no inducement. I shall go south tomorrow and see what that produces. If I cross no large creek within 45 miles in that direction, I shall then direct my course for the north-west of Fowler's Bay to see what is there.
To see what is there, to see what that produces. Stuart's crossed the range that now bears his name near Coober Pedy. Range here is a relative term, 200 metres above sea level. He's been out for 6 weeks. He's eked out his supplies. His horses struggle without shoes. The Australian idiom for his position is up shit creek without a paddle. But perhaps it's more a case of up a stony creek without a shovel. Digging through stony creek beds for water was an almost daily activity. He had a choice. Trace a route back to the known creek and water holes in the track to Port Augusta, or head into the harsh and bleak unknown and aim for the coast near Fowler's Bay. He chose to see what is there, to see what is there, not for Queen and Empire, not for fame and glory, certainly not for financial reward. He's working for Mr. Fink and James Chambers. Fink had shaken off the slime from the Padawalunga Glenelg land scam 20 years earlier, but really sullied his reputation in 1856 over the Great Northern Mine. Fink set sail for London with fraudulently obtaining mining leases over a worked-out empty mine in the Flinders Ranges. He was in cahoots with the Chambers brothers. they duped London investors of £160,000. This one was so bad there was even a parliamentary inquiry. Of course, it came to nothing. Too many skeletons in too many cupboards. The Commissioner of Crown Lands, J.B. Neils, issued the leases. He was also a director of the company. This is an early example of what we now call public-private partnership. Fink and the Chambers barely survived the scandal. Stuart struggled in the city. He needed the patronage of Fink and Chambers, and they needed him to further their pillage of pastoral and mining land. That patronage cost him dearly, as his reputation was sullied by association with these rascals. Stuart's statue in Victoria Square was not erected until 1902. It was not erected by a grateful government, but by the Caledonian Society to celebrate one of their own. They'd earlier honoured Robbie Burns, and he still stands on North Terrace outside the library. The Governor and Stuart's surviving companions did not attend the unveiling. The remainder of the slab of marble was used by the Italian family who imported it to make a mummy that was allegedly found on a farm in Beaumont. The press called it the mystery of the Beaumont girl. Adelaide, 1902. The statue does not do Stuart justice. The pith helmet is anachronistic, the cape nothing like his old-fashioned blue coat. He stands inert, rifle at his side, as if he's a prototype for the marble digger in memorials erected 20 years later in almost every town and suburb after the Great War. In what appears to be an act of one-upmanship in intercolonial rivalry, the citizens of Adelaide had celebrated Stuart's crossing of the continent by way of reenactment procession to the nearby Treasury building on the same day in January 1863 that Melbourne turned out to bury Burke and Wills, whose remains had finally been recovered. Captain Sturt, in bronze, on the other side of King William Street is alive and holds Stuart's tools of trade, maps and a telescope. Stuart's name appears on Sturt's statue. Stuart died in 1866 in London. He was a broken man, financially, physically and mentally. His funeral was attended by 7 people, and his death went unremarked by any government. Burke and Wills had been given state funerals, beginning an Australian tradition of celebrating heroic defeat.
Thursday the 29th of July, Mulga Plain, west of Lake Gardner. Our course today is 310 degrees. Left our camp at 8:30 and accomplished 20 miles of the same scrubby plain, slightly undulating. Plenty of grass, but no water. Same description of country as on the 18th instant. At 10 miles, having met with some rainwater, we halted, for the horses had been 3 nights without it. Foster bakes the last of our flour this afternoon, the last of our provisions. The first portion of our journey was over 6 miles of splendid alluvial country, covered with grass, partly spear grass, with a little salt bush intermixed with it. Also a few mulga bushes at intervals. No other timber. It is a most beautiful open piece of country and looks much better than the Adelaide Plains did at the commencement of the colony. We have also found a number of places where the natives have been encamped. They seem to be numerous, judging by the number of places where they have had their fires, but we have not seen any of them. Our black fellow left us during the night. He seemed to be very frightened of the other natives. He knows nothing of the country, and if he follows our tracks back, I don't envy him his walk. Camp without water. Distance today 20 miles.
The native guide walked back to Ayers Station near Port Augusta and reported that the 2 white men were way west in the Mallee and had run out of food. Little is known about Black, not even his name. Language from historical documents may offend. Those documents reflect the times.
Well, Mr. President, people do have a right to be bigots, you know.
Where do these people come from? By contemporary standards, one feels uneasy hearing Stuart describe his guide as our black, or the black fellow. Stuart, however, does not use pejorative language such as Warburton, who refers to the old woman whom he tormented with thirst so she would reveal the location of water, as a wretched savage. The first draft of King George's instructions to Governor Phillip deleted the words savages and substituted native when instructing Phillip to conciliate their affections and to live in amity and kindness with them. Stuart would have described himself as a native of Dysart, Scotland. Native from birthplace. This is the term he uses to describe the people he sees.
Saturday, 7th of August, sandhills going to the high mount. The journey today has been through horrid dense scrub and heavy sandhills to the foot of the hill which I have named Mount Fink. I almost give up hope of a good country. This is very disheartening after all that I have done to find it. If I see nothing from the top of the mount tomorrow, I must turn down to Fowler's Bay for water for the horses. As I could not remain quiet, I got on one of the lower spurs of Mount Fink to see what was before me. The prospect is gloomy in the extreme. I could see a long distance, but nothing met the eye, except a dense scrub as black and dismal as midnight. On my return, I found that Foster had succeeded in finding water by digging in the creek. Sunday, the 8th of August. At dawn of day, I ascended the mountain, but was unable to see much more than I did last night, in consequence of there being a mist all round. No high-rising ground is to be seen in any direction. A fearful country. In the last 8 miles, we haven't seen a mouthful for the horses to eat, and not a drop of water. It is even worse than Captain Sturt's desert, where there was a little salt bush, but here there is not a vestige. Wednesday, 11th of August, dense scrub. Left our camp at 8 on the same bearing, 180 degrees. At 9, obliged to halt for the remainder of the day, the horses being too tired to proceed further, and fearful sandhills are very trying for them. Today's few miles have been through the same dreary, dreadful, dismal desert of heavy sandhills and spinifex, with mallee very dense, scarcely a mouthful for the horses to eat. When will it have an end? My object now being to make Fowler's Bay for water for our horses, and thence to Streaky Bay, to endeavour to get some provisions there to carry us home. We have now travelled considerably upwards of 1,000 miles, and in that journey my horses have had only 4 clear days to themselves. They have done most excellently well. No water. Thursday the 12th of August, dense scrub, left at 8:20 on a bearing of 165 degrees, camped at 10 miles, the horses done up. The same dreary desert, no water.
Stuart and Foster struggled southward, arriving on the coast at Denial Bay, and after a further 3 days without food arrived at a shepherd's hut at Streaky Bay. He rode across Eyre Peninsula to Mount Arden, and in a spirit of goodwill allowed Babbage to copy his maps. Stuart returned to Adelaide, where he had been given up for dead. He was greeted with triumph. Fink and the Chambers played a cat and mouse game with the governor over his maps and journals, much to Stuart's detriment. The odium of the great northern mine fraud still hung over Fink and the Chambers. Stuart was denied the full rewards otherwise due to him. He was given a gold watch by the Royal Society. He returned to the desert 5 more times over the next 4 years and became the first European to cross the continent and return alive. They lost their shovel on the final journey. The last words belonged to Mr. Stuart.
Friday the 13th of August, dense scrub. The horses look very bad this morning. The country is still the same. This is dreadful work.